very timely moment at which to be thinking about these issues, whether we think about protesters protecting a statue of George Eliot in Nuneaton recently, or the I think 2 or 3 days ago, we had resurfaced backlash against Bernie for his waxing lyrical of Mount Rushmore back in 2016. So these are, as many of our topics have been, increasingly kind of present discussions. So I'm very excited to hear what everybody has to say. So to get the boring housekeeping bits out of the way first, each of our speakers will have 15 minutes to give their papers, at the end of which there will be about 15 minutes of question time, depending on how we're running. So if you have a question, do pop either just a statement that you have a question or the full question in the chat, which you can access in the top right-hand corner of Google Meets. And then I will direct your question to the panelists that you intend it for, which I would love for you to indicate as well, so that I don't have to guess. If you could all keep your microphones on mute while we have people presenting, that would be a great assistance both for the presenters and for everybody's kind of bandwidth issues. And you can have your camera on or off as you see fit, as long as you stay silent while everybody's speaking. So we might kick things off. The correct title is now Seductive Bazaars of Paris, Arcades, Department Stores, and the Crisis of French Colonialism. So Phoebe has just completed her MPhil in art history at the University of Cambridge. The title of her dissertation, which was supervised by Dr. Alice Mahn, is Under an Open Sky of Cloudless Blue, Giselle Freund and Walter Benjamin in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Sorry for my French. She plans, I'll modify that, to expand on her dissertation in her PhD thesis. Phoebe's research interests include film and photography, temporality and archives, and the writings of Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes. Whenever you're ready, Phoebe.
Thanks, Erin. Okay, just going to share my screen. Okay. Has that worked?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, as Erin said, the title of my paper is Seductive Bazaars of Paris, Arcades, Department Stores, and the Crisis of French Colonialism. From 1927 until his death in 1940, the German Jewish philosopher and writer Walter Benjamin devoted much of his scholarly attention to the Arcades project, an encyclopedic study of 19th century Paris, which, as its title suggests, centres on the arcades, the indoor shopping malls that were built in the city from the late 18th century until 1860. Although they were primarily commercial spaces, the arcades also housed cafes, theatres, and other forms of elite entertainment. Covered by glass roofs, supported by iron frameworks, and lit by gas lighting from 1817, the arcades were technical as well as social innovations. Benjamin was highly critical of the capitalist commodity culture that the arcades embodied, and in the exposé to the Arcades project that he had drafted in 1935, he describes the arcades and interiors, the exhibition halls and panoramas of 19th century Paris, as residues of a dream world, as wish symbols which, when turned to ruin, can be used to awaken capitalist society from its deceitful slumber. Benjamin argues that, in their decayed form, the collective social utopias embedded in these wish symbols are revealed to be nothing more than fantasies that will never be fulfilled under capitalism. In her post-colonial critique of the Arcades project, Caitlin van der Trop observes that, while the book's various themes converge on the consumer cultures at the height of urban and industrial growth in Europe, and specifically France, the period of focus also coincides with the rapid expansion of the French colonial empire, which in the years following 1830 stretched across Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and parts of China. Benjamin pays particular attention to the colonial context of the arcades, which he describes as seductive bazaars crammed with coffee, porcelain vases, and other exotic commodities which were made available in Paris by France's colonial commercial activity. Benjamin also attributes the popularity of department stores in the late 19th century to their ability to tap into Parisians' exotic fantasies. According to Benjamin, the first department stores appeared to be modelled on Oriental bazaars. From engravings, one sees that, at least around 1880, it was the fashion to cover with tapestries the balustrades of the staircases leading to the atrium. In this presentation, I will use Benjamin's representation of the arcades as unsettling yet enchanting spaces which are haunted by France's colonial past to illuminate the French filmmaker Chris Marker's representation of a modern Parisian department store in his 1962 science fiction film, La Jetée. Just before I begin my analysis of La Jetée, I will briefly summarise the film's narrative as it's quite complicated. So except for one brief moment of footage, Marker's 28-minute film consists entirely of black and white photographs which are animated by straight cuts, fades, dissolves, and other editing techniques. La Jetée begins with the unnamed male protagonist's recollection of a Sunday spent watching planes depart at the pier of Orly Airport in Paris when he was a child. Whereas the man vividly remembers seeing the face of a beautiful woman, his memory of seeing a man die that day is only a vague one. The film then moves forward to the outbreak of World War III, a conflict which, according to the film's narrator, leaves the world riddled with radioactivity. In Paris, survivors take refuge in the underground passages of the Palais de Chaillot before being taken captive by the victors of the war, who attempt to send prisoners through loopholes in time in order to summon past and future to the rescue of the present. Whereas some prisoners go mad or die, the protagonist's fixation on an image from his past enables him to travel back in time and visit the woman. He visits her several times before the experimenters send him to the future to retrieve a powerful unit strong enough to pull all human industry back into motion. Upon returning to the present, the man realizes that the camp guards intend to kill him because they no longer have a use for him. The men and women of the future visit the man and offer to make him one of their own, but he rejects the offer and instead requests to be sent back to the past, to his childhood image of the woman. The man is followed back in time by one of the camp guards, and upon seeing the guard, the man realizes that he cannot escape time, and that it was his own death he witnessed as a child. Paris's arcades do not feature in La Jetée, but their successors, the department stores, do. Beginning with Au Bon Marché in 1852, a number of department stores opened in Paris in the second half of the 19th century. The arcade's popularity began to wane because they could no longer compete with either the convenience nor the luxury of department stores. In contrast to the arcades, in which specialist shops sold unique and beautifully crafted goods, department stores sold a range of mass-produced goods in different departments. Whereas Benjamin conceives of the arcades as portals into 19th century Paris, the protagonist of La Jetée travels back in time to a department store in 1960s Paris to visit the woman whose face he has remembered. The narrator tells us that, in this timeless world that amazes him with its riches, the man becomes distracted and loses sight of the woman. Rather than focusing on the spectacle of the department store, the photographs in this sequence focus on the man's reaction to it. In one of the photographs, the man furrows his brow as he glances around the department store, taking in its astonishing materials: glass, plastic, terry cloth. The blurred background of the photograph evokes the man's trance-like state. La Jetée's contemporary audience would have been familiar with the department store, but by making his protagonist unfamiliar with it, Marker transforms the department store into an uncanny and disturbing space. The uncanny atmosphere of the department store is augmented by the mirrored wall, which distorts its interior. Mirrors form an important motif in the arcade project, and at one point, Benjamin describes Paris as a city of mirrors. He also suggests that the abundance of mirrors in the arcades amplifies the space and makes orientation more difficult, and he refers to the arcades themselves as schauplätze, as scenes or places for looking. In La Jetée, the man first sees the woman standing in front of the mirror and gazing at her reflection through her fingers, which she holds up to her face. The woman's placement of her fingers makes it uncertain whether she actually wants to see her reflection. Looking is also a gendered activity in the Arcades project, in which Benjamin suggests that women here in Paris look at themselves more than elsewhere, and from this comes the distinctive beauty of the Parisienne. Benjamin considers looking to be a primarily female activity, but he does acknowledge that in the Arcades, the man too sees his own physiognomy flash by. Likewise, several photographs in Les Jetées show the man in front of the department store mirror. However, unlike the woman, he never looks at his own reflection in it. Just as Benjamin indirectly criticizes 19th century Paris's consumer culture and its colonial underpinnings in the Arcades project, Marker indirectly criticizes that of 1960s Paris in Les Jetées. This is particularly true of the department store sequence, which Matthew Crooms has linked to the contemporary critiques of post-war consumer culture. In his 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord defines the spectacle as capital accumulated to the point where it becomes an image. Marker also presents life under capitalism as a disembodied experience in which images reign supreme. In the department store sequence, the protagonist is distanced from his surroundings by the reflective surfaces of the store's mirrors and windows. In contrast to Benjamin, who focuses on the ruination of the Arcades and the decline of the consumer culture which they embodied, Marker focuses on France's rapid modernization during the early 1960s. In her study of mid-1950s to mid-1960s France, Christian Ross considers the intricate relationship between French modernization and decolonization. After all, this decade not only saw the consolidation of France's Fordist regime, but the collapse of its empire, when in May 1962, the signing of the Evian Accords officially announced the hard-won independence of Algeria, France's last major colony. The modern department store in Les Jetées, particularly the astonishing materials which fascinate the protagonist, are symptomatic of what Ross has described as France's turn towards a form of interior colonization during this period. Ross argues that, with the waning of France's empire, rational administrative techniques developed in the colonies were brought home and put to use side by side with new technological innovations, such as advertising and reordering metropolitan domestic society, the everyday life of its citizens. There was an overwhelming sense that, if Algeria was to become an independent nation, then France must compensate its loss by becoming a modern nation. Thus, whereas Americans experienced modernization gradually from the early 20th century onwards, the lives of many French citizens were transformed by electricity, refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, cars, and other innovations within a very short time frame. This interpretation of Les Jetées is supported by the fact that Marker had previously collaborated with the French filmmaker Alain Resnais on Le Statut meurt aussi, a documentary in which the disintegration of French art is attributed to the cultural imperialism of French colonial powers. Further, Marker took the photographs for Les Jetées whilst filming Le Joli Mai, a documentary portrait of Paris and its citizens just after the end of the Algerian War. Marker alludes to the Algerian War in the camp sequences of Les Jetées, as well as in the department store sequence I've discussed. With its German-speaking guards and its inhumane scientific experiments, the camp in Les Jetées has often been compared to a Nazi concentration camp. Drawing on The Question, a horrific account of torture in Algeria, written by the French-Algerian journalist Henri in 1958, Crooms argues that there are also parallels between the camp in Les Jetées and the French concentration camps of the Algerian War. Like the protagonist of Les Jetées, Alec is subjected to electronic shocks and is drugged with pentothal by his captors. During one interrogation, Alec hallucinates that Marcel, the camp doctor who has injected him with pentothal, is pursuing him through the streets of Algiers and plying him with questions. This episode may have directly influenced the narrative of Les Jetées, in which the protagonist travels back in time to different spaces in Paris whilst being pursued by one of the camp guards. So, to conclude, I have demonstrated in this presentation that Benjamin and Marker respectively conceived of Paris's arcades and department stores as unsettling yet enchanting spaces which are haunted by France's colonial past. In the Arcades project, Benjamin excavates the ruined arcades of the 20th century, and in doing so, he exposes the colonial underpinnings of 19th century Paris's consumer culture. In La Jetée, by contrast, Marker conceives of the shiny new department stores of early 1960s Paris as testimony to France's turn towards a form of interior colonization in response to the collapse of its empire. So thanks everyone, that's it. Cool. Oops, there we go.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Phoebe. I also have lots of questions
Thanks.
for you.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Great. Well, we will move now to our final panelist for today, Emily Roach, whose paper is entitled Witness to an Unbroken Spirit, Poetry from the AIDS Pandemic. So, Emily, let me find you, is a third-year PhD candidate in English literature at the University of York, a lecturer in law at a university in Leeds, a writer and an LGBTQIA activist. Emily's thesis focuses on contemporary transgender spoken word poets. Emily's broader research includes contemporary American LGBT media, memoir, fiction and poetry, slam poetry, and queer space and music subcultures in post-1960s Britain. Much of Emily's research works at the intersections of queer identity and pop culture, and she's published extensively on television, pop music, and popular works of fiction, including a paper on the Netflix series Stranger Things, titled AIDS, Homophobia, and the Monstrous Upside Down. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if this works. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Great. Right, I might have some tech issues with this, but hopefully not. Okay, so the phrase witness to an unbroken spirit is a quote from American poet and literature professor Melvin Dixon. During a public address in 1992, Dixon said, "I come to you bearing witness to a broken heart. I come to you bearing witness to a broken body, but witness to an unbroken spirit." In the same speech, which would be the final one before his death, Dixon said, "I may not be there for the development of gay literature, but I'll be somewhere listening for my name. You then are charged with the possibility of your good health to remember us." For the Black, gay poets, writers, activists, filmmakers, and artists such as Melvin Dixon, Essex Hemphill, Joseph Beam, Marlon Riggs, and Osoto Saint, the act of recording their experiences through print and film was a vital part of their activism. Their works collectively mark a period of Black creative cultural output that Martin Duberman terms the Second Harlem Renaissance. Their works explore communal grief together with deeply intimate personal accounts of desire and loss. Recording their experiences was a concern of many of these writers during their lifetimes, both poets and their own historians and archivists. In Dixon's poem Heartbeats, the sparse formulaic verses mimic the sounds of a beating heart, and Chris Mustatsa describes that rhythmic function as part of striving for normalcy and working against the othering of AIDS patients. The poem's rhythms keep both the individual and collective heart of queer community beating through the stanzas. Sweetheart, don't stop. Darius Bost, an associate professor at Utah, has researched Dixon's public speeches through the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. He writes that the 1992 speech demonstrates Dixon's concerns for how he might be perceived as a Black gay man with AIDS, a highly stigmatized identity. This stigma was heightened by government apathy that gave white, straight, gender-normative America tacit permission to look away as the crisis decimated marginalized communities. For those who didn't live through the early decades of HIV/AIDS, it is useful to pause on our own experiences with COVID. Consider any time you have expressed frustration over the speed or nature of official responses to the current pandemic. Now consider this. The first case of AIDS presented itself in America in 1981, and it was not until September 1985 that President Ronald Reagan first said the word AIDS in public. Although the topic was raised at several press conferences, the press secretary Larry Speakes joked about fairies, the gay plague, and cruising, as gathered journalists laughed when Speakes insisted that the reporter who raised the questions should get himself tested. By the time Reagan made comprehensive speeches on the topic of AIDS, it was 1987. Over 35,000 Americans had been diagnosed and nearly 30,000 had died. Keep in mind how high the death rate was in the early days of HIV/AIDS. During the 80s, gay men had little to no legislative protection, and homophobia and moral outrage dominated the media. At the highest levels of government, AIDS was dismissed as somebody else's problem. Whilst all gay men suffered homophobia during the AIDS years, Black gay men experienced the same homophobia together with anti-Blackness that operated within and outside queer communities. Darius Bost considers Dixon's use of the phrase double cremation as a term that captures, quote, how the obliterating forces of anti-Blackness and anti-queerness doubly marked the Black gay body for social and corporeal death. Despite the understandable rage, grief, and isolation that occupies many of these poets' works, however, many are also defiant and radical celebrations of Black queer love, sexuality, and desire. Just see if my clip works. That clip is from Tongues Untied, a documentary film directed by Marlon Riggs. Born in Texas in the late 1950s, Riggs became a professor of journalism and made many films throughout his life. Tongues Untied merged poetry, song, voguing, and documentary footage to capture Black, gay, and gender non-conforming experience. The documentary featured writers such as Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill and caused considerable controversy amongst outraged conservatives for its frank depiction of desire between Black men. Silence equals death has become such an iconic slogan of the AIDS activist movement, such as ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, founded by Larry Kramer in New York. This linking of AIDS with the oppression of silence also runs throughout the activism of many of the Black activists, such as Riggs. In the words of Riggs himself, Tongues Untied was designed to, quote, shatter the nation's brutalizing silence on matters of sexual and racial difference. The quote that appeared at the end of that clip was written by Joseph Beam in his book In the Life, a Black Gay Anthology, published in 1986. For Beam, memorialising Black creative output during the AIDS crisis seems to have been an essential part of his activism. He said, quote, transmitting our stories by word of mouth does not possess archival permanence. Survival is visibility. Beam's Black Men Loving Black Men statement has been shared widely online today. His words both memorialise a specific moment of the past, but also lend poetic charge to a new wave of Black-led activism, surviving and taking on renewed purpose when redistributed in the context of today's movement, where the intersections of Blackness and LGBTQ+ identity are at the forefront. In my research into transgender poetry and memoir, I write about the work poets of I study in my thesis undertake to fill what Jacqueline Pryor terms the hole in history, a slippage of trans stories from mainstream narrative. This kind of historical slippage can also be observed in the case of some scholarship on HIV/AIDS literature, which omits Black voices and perpetuates the idea of a white literary canon. This issue is compounded by the fact that many of these poets' works are now out of print, and as such, Darius Bost's Evidence of Being, with its comprehensive archival research and first-hand accounts, is an essential resource. Bost's work bears witness to these important creators, but he's also conscious about the role of the future witness, as this quote here explains. It is not for us, the future witness, to try to impose sense or orderliness, but to read and learn from the words as they stand. He devotes a whole chapter of his thesis to Melvin Dixon's diaries, the function of the diarist to provide a record of his own history. Although he is careful to let the words of those he has researched speak for themselves, Bost's thesis is also vital in its investment in finding radical joy and resistance in literature that is so often contextualized by the landscape of abandonment, poverty, government neglect, and grief. Essex Hemphill was born in 1957 and succumbed to AIDS-related illnesses in 1995. Essex was born in Chicago but spent much of his life in Washington, D.C. His own words on community reflect how Black gay men often felt distanced from the white gay community. He wrote, "There was no gay community for Black men to come home to in the 1980s. The community we found was as mythical and distant from the realities of Black men as was Oz from Kansas. The best gay minds of my generation believe that we speak as one voice and dream one dream, but we are not monolithic. We are not even respectful of one another's differences. We are a long way from that, Dorothy. I tell you, Kansas is closer." This excerpt from his poem, The Tomb of Sorrow, sees Hemphill writing about his funeral as a celebration of life. The images of death are juxtaposed by the vivacity of queer life through references to go-go music, dance and sweat, and Hemphill's Black diva drag queen angels. This juxtaposition of death with the dance and sweat and sex of gay bars reappears in a poem called The Brass Rail, a collaboration between Essex Hemphill and Wason Jones. I'm going to share an excerpt from their performance recorded for Isaac Julian's Looking for Langston, a film released in 1989 that explored Black queerness during the Harlem Renaissance, the title a reference to poet Langston Hughes. Jones is the only poet I mentioned that is alive today, and as such was interviewed by Darius Bost and explained that the Brass Rail was named after one of Washington's oldest gay bars, situated in a red light district. The poem responded to a string of trick murders at the Brass Rail. Bost points out that the poem employs the call and response style of communication rooted in Black religious tradition and describes the piece as a site of ecstasy and fear, of communal eroticism and the shared threat of terror that makes intelligible the forces devaluing Black, queer and gender variant lives.
I'm not sure that we're getting sound on that one, am I?
Can you not? Sorry, you can't hear the sound?
No.
Can you hear it now?
No, sorry, I don't know what that will be.
Okay, how strange. Okay, it's on YouTube. That's a shame. Wason
Maybe we
Jones.
can put a link in the chat.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah,
later. Yeah.
That sounds good. Yes, it's actually on Wason Jones's channel, so yes, it should be able to find it there. Okay, so the poem makes visible sex and sexuality, but it also emphasises the risks posed to Black gay men in the narrower sense of the murders associated with the Brass Rail and in the wider context of AIDS. There is a sense of foreboding, a frenetic pace to the poem as the dual voices engage in a dance that crescendos and climaxes, culminating in the final sobering line, "Many occupants are never found." I've quoted a short excerpt from Hempel's poem Black Beans here, as it captures how Hempel often works with those intersections of anti-Blackness, anti-queerness and poverty, together with unapologetic writing about sexual desire. In The Brass Rail, the bodies of the street workers never found speaks to the disposability and value of lives, the reference to uninvestigated Black queer death and the violence experienced by those living on the margins of American society, of course, still an issue today. The final poet I want to mention is Lesotho Saint. Born in Haiti, Saint was one of the first Black activists to write about being HIV positive in his poetry, music, and plays. He appeared in one of Marlon Riggs's documentary films and had his poetry featured in Joseph Beam's anthology, In the Life. Saint also curated his own edited collections, which gave a voice to Black poets of the late 90s, many of whom were inspired by the poets before them. Poet and writer Victoria Brownworth, who knew Saint personally, describes him as a war poet. She writes, "He was a poet of the AIDS war, and more than that, he was a poet of the Black voices of the AIDS war, the unheard, unmentioned voices that he was desperate to keep alive in any way he could." Saint, like the other poets, considered the archiving of literary contributions from marginalised voices as a matter of pressing urgency. It is unsurprising that he felt this task to be so important during an era when so many creatives were lost, and knowing the discard with which history of marginalised groups has been treated in the past. Brownworth writes that Saint had to collect the bits and pieces that would create a different kind of names quilt, the angry verses, the embittered stanzas, the breathy last couplets of the dying. Melvin Dixon has tasked us with remembering, and I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to some of the poetry, film, and activism, or that you will enjoy when you go away and listen to The Brass Rail, at least that you will enjoy that poem, together with the extensive research efforts of people like Darius Bost that have made works like Melvin Dixon's diaries more widely accessible. During their lifetimes, these creators were not just recording their day-to-day lives, they were also building archives and curating a collection of anthologies, diaries, video footage, and art that worked to counter what Bost describes as writing that, quote, marked Black gay personhood as an impossible mode of being. Of course, despite my emphasis on history and memory, HIV, AIDS, anti-Blackness, and queerphobia are not issues of the past. The Black AIDS Institute has produced multiple reports explaining how Black Americans continue to be disproportionately impacted by HIV, including the profound impact on Black transgender people. The works of these poets speak to both the past and present, and they sought to humanize the marginalized and stigmatized, to put their own writing and the writing of others into print so historians could not whitewash, erase, or forget. It is unsurprising that the words of these poets and activists continue to be shared in the context of today's civil rights movement, as they too were confronted with state violence, silencing, and erasure. They too emphasised through their vast and varied works as they confronted their own death that Black Lives Matter. I was going to show another clip at the end of that, but as it doesn't seem to be working, I think I'll just drop that link in the chat as well.
That'd be great. Thank you, Emily. Perfect. All right. It is now question time, and I have a few things brewing, but I'd love to open up the floor to anybody who is curious about anything our presenters have said. So I'll give you a minute to brew things. Okay, well, if nobody's falling over themselves to begin, I have a question first for Phoebe, I think. Oh, don't look so scared. I was really interested in Benjamin's characterization of the arcades as seductive, and it seemed to me that his notion of seduction there seemed to have something to do not just with like exoticness and otherness, but also with something lost to time, like something that's like kind of separate from us in temporal kind of remove, as well as something spatially and culturally removed. So I was wondering how that idea of seduction does or doesn't work in the flat, like, spectacle of the department store, in which time seems to function very differently. And I don't know the marker film very well, but I wondered if there was anything going on there.
So the idea of spectacle. Yes, probably.
Yeah. Well, what does happen in the scene in the department store in the film?
Okay, so the department store scene is the first time that the man manages to travel back in time and sees the woman. And he's kind of caught up like in kind of like all the modern materials, so like terry cloth and everything in the department store. And he's kind of just gazing around, and then he spots the woman, but he very quickly, even though he's been looking for her, becomes distracted by his surroundings. But it's kind of like a very alienating, strange scene, because I think I mentioned like this is a very familiar kind of almost mundane scene, but then the kind of man's almost looking at it like through new eyes, because he's going back in time to look at it, and he's like, for him this is just all like fascinating and like wonderful kind of, and so I guess he kind of helps people look at the scene through like a new lens almost, like through the distance of retrospect almost. Yeah. I'm not really
interesting.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I think it's super interesting. There seems to be really different things going on with how like memory and a connection to the past works in both of those spaces. So yeah, super interesting.
But you're right. I think like for Benjamin more than Marco, but for both of them a bit, like Benjamin's very critical of the arcades and like of the capitalist like consumerist culture they embody, but he's also, you can tell he is like slightly captivated by it. Like at the same time he's kind of drawn in by it, even though he recognizes that this is something negative and actually like something that he ideologically opposes. And I think that's less for Marco. I think it's very much clearer in Le Jeté that he's literally just showing you how the man's experiencing it, and that he himself isn't caught up in this, like in the world of the department store. But I think in the Arcades project, it's a lot less clear cut. Like Benjamin kind of moves between critiquing it and actually kind of almost like reveling in it slightly, which is interesting. Like I wouldn't describe it as nostalgic, but there's a definite like sense of longing for the past, even though he recognizes that it's not necessarily a positive past, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, that ambivalence might be an interesting thing to think about with our other panelists as well. But I think we do. Yes, we have a question for Claire from Sophie. Sophie, are you still here?
Yes, sorry, just trying to figure out how to unmute myself.
Hi.
Thank you all for such great papers. It was really a pleasure to listen to all of them. And I was wondering, I was thinking also, my paper yesterday a little bit about symbolism and conservatism. And one thing that I just read in the news recently was about Trump considering displaying these Confederate monuments or just statues in general as props at campaign rallies, which just seems like a crazy sort of decontextualization of, I don't know, just sort of a wild thing in general. But sort of related to that, I don't know, I was thinking about that when you talked about the idea of the covered up monuments as a new way of thinking about how we can sort of occupy public space. And I don't know, I was really stunned when I saw the boxed up Churchill statue, like the kind of potentiality of it, and like the weird, just the way it sort of intervened in the public space. And I was wondering if you had any more thoughts about that, or just, could say a little bit more about like what the sort of covering up of monuments can do. I mean, obviously the point is to protect them from defacement, but as a visual symbol, like what that might mean. So that was a bit of a long-winded question, but thank you for such an interesting paper.
Thank you for your question and your paper yesterday. I haven't heard that he suggested using them as props. That's really interesting, and slightly worrying to have that kind of identification with such a kind of controversial figures. Sorry, popular in the email. But boxing of monuments, yeah. Sorry, I'll take that off. Yeah, I guess because it's very difficult in art history in terms of our methodology, or in terms of we sort of depend on it, like looking at these things and studying them depends on our capacity to see them. And so boxing them, it does introduce, for aesthetic reasons, a kind of problem in the sense of it makes you it almost kind of deflects attention away from detail to more systematic or systemic kind of problems, which I think is one of the kind of, I guess, more artistic effects that this could have. It's sort of, I guess, when I see sort of boxing them for kind of political statements, or sort of which are less official in terms of protection, it sort of suggests a kind of temporariness, like whether that kind of box is going to be removed once like the protests have sort of passed their sort of high, like sort of most intense phase, or whether that boxing sort of suggests a temporary kind of storage, which I mean that's also kind of worrying concept in the sense of like, at what, if this is kind of a storage system, then at what stage do we think that could possibly be appropriate again in public space? And that's kind of a worrying kind of I guess kind of part of that. But I think boxing in terms of I guess a sort of drawing attention to other kind of I guess the kind of broader situation, I think, is kind of an interesting way of doing it. Kind of deflects attention away from the object, which I think can become quite empowered and distracts from the issue of the protests. I don't feel I've answered that question particularly well, but is that some kind of response?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. I think we have a question from Nina. Yes. So this
Sorry,
is.
I thought I'd say it wrong if I tried to say it, so I wrote it down.
Oh, good. So this is for Phoebe. And Nina says, picking up on your answer to Ern's question, Phoebe, do you think that Marker's use of film, photography, and collage, as opposed to text quotation collage, or whatever the Arcades project is, with this gesture, allows for a more ambivalent or distanced way of engaging with commodities and capitalism? What difference does form make to that engagement? Good question.
Interesting. Thanks, Nina. So yeah, as you say, for all those of you that aren't familiar with the Arcades project, like it wasn't actually finished. Like Benjamin died before he ever finished it. So it basically consists of like fragments, like passages from various texts which he collated under different sections. So you might have like a section on advertising, but then you've also got like a section on like prostitution or whatever. And he also like put his own thoughts in. So yeah, like Le Jeté, it's quite interesting because they're both kind of collage format. So you've got a collage of quotations in the Arcades project, and like obviously a collage of photographs in Le Jeté. But I would say it certainly, to answer Nina's question, makes for a more ambivalent, I guess, approach. Marcus' use of like photography and images and film. But I wouldn't necessarily say distance, because as I talked about, you've got like Debord, who wrote about kind of how capitalism like transformed everything into an image and a spectacle. So he's directly kind of using, like you've got the kind of these flashes of images, like as I said, some of them kind of fade and dissolve, but you also get kind of these sudden flashes of images, which I guess, so he's kind of directly transforming everything into an image, whereas Benjamin also saw kind of his text bits, he saw them as images, he described them as dialectical images. But yeah, I guess you've got the like the visual kind of, which I think it makes it a different engagement. So I guess, yeah, as I said earlier, Benjamin is kind of more ambivalent in what he writes about capitalism. But then I guess you could say that in form, maybe Marcus is actually more ambivalent. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Very good. This also reminds me of a question that I have been pondering during Emily's presentation. I think it will start off. Oh, Phoebe also has a question for Emily. Okay. Well, we'll come back to mine. Phoebe, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, sorry. Hi, Emily. I thought your presentation was great, but I just wanted. I listened to what you said about Asoto Saint and archives and creating archives, and I was just thinking, because in looking for Langston, obviously, there's a lot of use of archival material, but also the idea of like filling in gaps in the archives with like fantasy and fiction and imagination. And I was just wondering if you think that's like a wider trend, maybe like within the work of like Asoto Saint and others, like poets and stuff, or if you think that was just like Julian, or if like basically just like if like fiction or whatever, like how that kind of worked, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, I think it definitely was. I think what sort of strikes me about a lot of the poets that I talked about, and particularly, obviously, as you say, there was a particular concern with that with the Asoto Saint, but a lot of them produced anthologies. So it wasn't just, although they obviously had their own edited collection, they had their own poetry collections and films and so on. A lot of it kind of had, there were a number of anthologies of other poets as well, and showcasing other voices and kind of collecting and bringing together all of these materials from other creatives that were kind of working around the same time. And you see that very much in the documentary films as well of Marlon Riggs, where it's bringing together a number of different people who are kind of working with poetry and working creatively with processing, I guess, the impact of HIV/AIDS. And I think that approach, and particularly when you think about the way that those voices actually have, to an extent, been marginalized from the way that the HIV/AIDS crisis is written about. I think the fact that they saw during their lifetimes that importance of kind of amplifying not only their own but other voices and providing that printed record tells us quite a lot about sort of history's perpetual tendency to erase the more marginalized voices. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's really interesting, thanks.
This does actually lead really naturally into what I was going to ask you anyway, Emily, which is jumps off your formulation. It kind of came in later in the presentation about thinking or framing the AIDS pandemic as the AIDS war, which made me think about this kind of like tonal difference between like war poetry, like when we think about whatever Sassoon, like on the Eastern Front or whatever, and the kind of poetry that we've looked at in your presentation, which also, we might think about as something to do with memorializing as well. But it seems like there's a real tonal difference there. And I was wondering if you could speak to why maybe you think that is, or what the differing aims of those two kinds of memorialization might have been.
Yeah, of course. I will say I'm not a particular expert on war poetry, so I'm probably going to expose some, some knowledge weaknesses here. But actually, that's something that Brownworth does. The quote that I gave about Asoto Saint in that context does actually mention Sassoon and mentions like the war poets, and kind of says that the writers that documented HIV/AIDS through poetry were effectively becoming war poets of a different sort. And of course, I mean, it depends, because it's all about the context, isn't it? And it's all about those poems are always contextualized by that specific moment in history. So whether it's a war poet that's trying to, I guess, I don't know, celebrate, or whether it's a war poet that is really against the kind of jingoism of war and talks about that and talks about people losing their lives, it's quite a very specific historical context. And I think the thing that you find with AIDS is a lot of the poetry has this kind of desire to speak to a collective experience where people in their own voices, which is why I was a bit, it was a bit of a shame I couldn't let some of the poets speak for themselves during the presentation, if that makes sense. But speaking to both a collective experience, but also really giving at times extremely intimate insight into their personal experiences, their personal loss and their personal lives. And it's sort of a trend that throughout HIV/AIDS literature of that 80s, 90s period is there. I think the other thing that is perhaps slightly relevant is a lot of the better known works of literature, and this includes the HIV/AIDS literature by writers like Paul Manette and slightly less so Larry Kramer, but because a lot of his work was essays and plays designed to heighten awareness. It all comes a bit later. So it's sort of a lot of the better known works come around the late 80s, mid 90s, early to mid 90s. And a lot of writers have talked about the fact that whilst they were in the midst of this AIDS war, I guess, they couldn't process it. They couldn't make narrative sense of what was happening. And so it became very difficult to think in any way with any creative coherency about how they might document those experiences. And as I say, I don't know enough about the war poets to know quite whether that would be a difference there, or actually whether that's a similar kind of looking backward type of approach. Sorry, I think I went off tangent there, but.
No, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. Great. Now we might, Emily, I've just remembered that we were going to pop the links to your videos in the
Yes.
Have you done that yet or not?
No, I haven't. But okay. Why don't I email you and it can maybe go out with the bibliography, if that's all right?
Yeah, that would be perfect. Great.
That might be easiest.
Very good. Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, which doesn't look like there are, we are just about on time to wrap up. In which case, I've got to say a big thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. These were really, really thought-provoking presentations, so thank you so much. And to, Hetty says, okay, says thank you. Very good. Wonderful. Thanks, Hetty. Just a final note before we go is that our keynote presentation is the only thing that yet remains in the conference. And that is Dr. Catherine Angel speaking at 2 p.m. British time, which is in just under 3 hours. Woohoo. Thank you, Nina. 2 p.m. Okay, that's probably, we won't confuse you with more than one number. It's at 2 p.m. And that looks like it's going to be great. So I look forward to seeing some of you there. But thanks very much.